Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his forehead as he secured the last fence post of the day. The Arizona sun had been merciless, even though it was now well past sunset. His ranch stretched out before him, 2,000 acres of hard-won land that had taken him 15 years to build from nothing. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and his modest farmhouse sat nestled among the cottonwood trees he had planted when he first arrived. At 35, Thomas had weathered many storms. He had fought in the war, lost his wife to fever 3 years ago, and worked every day since dawn to keep his dream alive. The McKenna Ranch was all he had left, and he protected it fiercely. His neighbors respected him for his fairness and his willingness to help others, but they also knew not to cross him when it came to his land. The night air was crisp as Thomas walked toward his house, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He was looking forward to a hot meal and some rest when he heard something unusual. A sound carried on the wind that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of someone crying. Thomas stood perfectly still, listening carefully. The crying came again, carried by the desert breeze. It sounded like a woman, and she was in distress. His hand instinctively moved to the gun at his hip as he scanned the darkness. Living on the frontier meant always being ready for trouble, whether it came from outlaws, wild animals, or hostile raiders. The sound came from the direction of Devil's Canyon, a rocky area about a mile north of his property. Thomas knew the terrain well. It was treacherous at night, full of loose rocks and hidden crevices. Whatever had happened there, someone was in serious trouble. Thomas quickly saddled his horse, a reliable mare named Belle who had served him faithfully for years. He grabbed his rifle, a lantern, and his medical supplies. Living alone on a ranch meant being prepared to handle injuries, and Thomas had learned basic doctoring from necessity. As he rode toward Devil's Canyon, the crying grew louder and more desperate. Thomas pushed Belle carefully through the rocky terrain, using his lantern to avoid the dangerous spots. The moon was only a sliver, providing little natural light to guide his way. When he reached the edge of the canyon, Thomas could see the glow of a small fire far below. Near the fire, he could make out figures moving in the darkness. He dismounted and crept closer, keeping low behind the rocks. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 men had set up camp in a small clearing. They wore the clothes of drifters and outlaws, with gun belts slung low on their hips. Near the fire, a young woman sat with her hands tied behind her back. Even in the flickering firelight, Thomas could see that she was hurt. Her clothes were torn and there was blood on her face. The woman was clearly Apache, with long black hair and the distinctive clothing of her people. But what struck Thomas most was her unusually pale skin, lighter than most Apache he had encountered. She was beautiful despite her injuries, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that reflected the firelight. "Please," she said in accented English, "let me go home to my people. I have done nothing to you." One of the men, a tall brute with a scarred face, laughed cruelly. "You're worth good money, girl. There's men in town who pay well for Apache women, especially pretty ones like you. You ain't going nowhere." Thomas felt his jaw clench with anger. He had seen many terrible things in his life, but kidnapping and human trafficking was something that made his blood boil. He counted the men again, 3 of them, all armed. The odds weren't great, but he couldn't just ride away and leave the woman to her fate. He studied the camp layout carefully. The men were relaxed, passing around a bottle of whiskey and laughing loudly. They clearly didn't expect any trouble. Their horses were tied up about 20 yards away, and their weapons were within reach but not in their hands. Thomas made his decision. He tied Belle securely to a sturdy bush and checked his weapons one more time. His plan was simple but risky: create a distraction, take out as many of the kidnappers as possible, and get the woman to safety. He had surprise on his side, but he would have to move fast. Moving silently through the rocks, Thomas positioned himself above the camp. He picked up several large stones and prepared to throw them to the far side of the clearing. If he could get the men to investigate the noise, he might be able to get closer to the woman. Just as Thomas was about to throw the first stone, one of the kidnappers stood up and walked toward the woman. The man was clearly drunk and had evil intentions written all over his face. Thomas knew he couldn't wait any longer. "That's far enough," Thomas called out, stepping into the firelight with his rifle aimed at the men. "Let the woman go and nobody has to get hurt." The 3 kidnappers scrambled for their weapons, but Thomas had the advantage of surprise and better positioning. He fired a warning shot that sent dirt flying near their feet, causing them to dive for cover. I said let her go, Thomas shouted. This is your only warning. The scarred leader emerged from behind a rock with his gun drawn. You picked the wrong fight, mister. There's 3 of us and 1 of you. Walk away now and we'll let you live. Can't do that, Thomas replied calmly. The woman comes with me. The standoff lasted for several tense seconds. Thomas could see the woman watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. She had stopped crying and was now alert, ready to move if she got the chance. Suddenly, one of the other kidnappers tried to circle around behind Thomas. Thomas spun and fired, winging the man in the shoulder and sending him tumbling behind a boulder. The other 2 men opened fire, forcing Thomas to duck behind cover as bullets whined off the rocks around him. The gun battle was fierce but brief. Thomas used his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage, moving from rock to rock and keeping the kidnappers pinned down. When one of them tried to reach the horses, Thomas put a bullet in the ground right in front of him, sending the man scrambling back to cover. During a lull in the shooting, Thomas heard the woman call out, "The rope! It's burning!" The fire had spread to some dry grass near where she was sitting, and the rope binding her hands was starting to smolder. Thomas realized this was his chance. While the kidnappers were focused on him, the woman might be able to free herself. He kept up a steady rate of fire, forcing the men to keep their heads down while the rope burned through. Finally, he saw the woman stand up, her hands free. She looked around desperately for an escape route, but the kidnappers were between her and the only safe path out of the canyon. Over here, Thomas called to her, "Can you climb?" The woman nodded and began scrambling up the rocky slope toward Thomas's position. The kidnappers realized what was happening and tried to stop her, but Thomas laid down covering fire that kept them pinned behind the rocks. The climb was treacherous in the darkness, and the woman slipped several times on the loose stones. Thomas could see that she was injured and exhausted, but she kept climbing with determined courage. When she was close enough, Thomas reached down and pulled her up to his position. "Can you ride?" he asked quickly. "Yes," she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "My horse is tied up over there. Go to her and wait for me. Her name is Belle, she's gentle." The woman nodded and disappeared into the darkness. Thomas continued to exchange gunfire with the kidnappers for several more minutes, making sure they stayed pinned down. When he was confident the woman had reached safety, he began his own retreat. Moving carefully through the rocks, Thomas made his way back to where Belle was waiting. The Apache woman was already there, holding the horse's reins and looking back toward the canyon with worried eyes. "Are you hurt badly?" Thomas asked as he untied Belle. "I will live," she replied simply, "but we must go quickly, they will follow." Thomas helped her mount Belle, then swung up behind her. The horse was strong enough to carry them both, at least until they reached safety. As they rode away from Devil's Canyon, Thomas could hear the kidnappers shouting and cursing in the distance. They would be coming after them soon, but on foot in the darkness, they wouldn't be able to move very fast. The ride back to Thomas's ranch was tense and silent. The woman sat stiffly in front of him, clearly in pain but not complaining. Thomas kept checking behind them for signs of pursuit, but the night remained quiet except for the sound of Belle's hooves on the hard ground. When they finally reached the ranch house, Thomas helped the woman down from the horse. In the light from his porch lantern, he could see her injuries more clearly. She had a cut on her forehead, bruises on her arms, and her clothes were torn and dirty. But her eyes were alert and intelligent, and she held herself with dignity despite everything she had been through. "You're safe now," Thomas said gently. "Let me take care of those wounds." The woman looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Why did you help me? Most white men would not risk their lives for an Apache woman." Thomas considered the question seriously. "Because it was the right thing to do. No one deserves to be treated the way those men were treating you." "My name is Ayana," the woman said quietly. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "I'm Thomas McKenna. This is my ranch." He gestured toward the house and surrounding land. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to recover." Yana nodded slowly. "I am grateful for your kindness, Thomas McKenna, but my people will be looking for me. I must return to them soon, or they will think I am dead." "Where is your village?" Thomas asked as he led her toward the house. 2 days' ride to the north in the mountains beyond Red Mesa. I was gathering herbs for my grandmother when those men found me." Her voice grew hard with anger. "They took me 3 days ago. I thought I would never see my family again." Thomas pushed open the door to his house and lit several oil lamps. The interior was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and Native American rugs that his late wife had collected. He pointed to a chair near the fireplace. "Sit down and rest. I'll get some supplies to clean those wounds." As Thomas gathered bandages and medicine, he found himself thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. This morning, his biggest concern had been fixing a broken fence. Now he had an injured Apache woman in his house and 3 dangerous men somewhere out there who wanted her back. He had acted on instinct when he heard Ayana crying in the canyon. The idea of leaving her to her fate had never even occurred to him. But now he realized that his decision might have consequences he hadn't considered. The kidnappers would probably seek revenge, and Ayana's people might not understand why a white rancher had their daughter. When Thomas returned with the medical supplies, he found Ayana examining one of the rugs on his wall. It was a beautiful piece with traditional Apache designs, woven in earth tones that seemed to glow in the lamplight. "This is beautiful work," Ayana said, running her fingers along the intricate patterns. "It was made by my people." "My wife bought it from a trader several years ago," Thomas explained. "She always admired Apache craftsmanship." "Your wife, where is she now?" Ayana asked. "She died 3 years ago. Fever took her." Thomas's voice was quiet but steady. He had learned to speak of his loss without breaking down, but it still hurt. "I am sorry," Ayana said with genuine sympathy. "Loss is hard to bear alone." Thomas began cleaning the cut on her forehead, working gently to remove the dried blood. "This might sting a little," he warned. Yana didn't flinch as he worked. She was clearly used to enduring pain without complaint. As Thomas bandaged her wounds, he found himself studying her face. She was remarkably beautiful, with delicate features that seemed almost aristocratic. Her pale skin was unusual for an Apache, giving her an exotic, ethereal quality that was striking. "You're not like other Apache I've met," Thomas said, then immediately regretted the comment. It sounded rude, even though he hadn't meant it that way. Yana smiled slightly. "My father was Apache, but my mother was Mexican. She was taken in a raid when she was young, but she chose to stay with my father when she could have returned to her people. I inherited her pale skin and his strong spirit." "That explains it," Thomas said. "I was wondering about your coloring." "It has always made me different," Yana said with a trace of sadness. "Some in my tribe see it as a blessing, others as a curse. The Mexican soldiers who sometimes patrol our territory often mistake me for one of their own people until they see my clothes and hear me speak Apache." Thomas finished bandaging her wounds and stepped back. "There, that should help them heal properly. Are you hungry? I can make some food." "I have not eaten in 2 days," Ayana admitted, "but I do not wish to be a burden." "It's no burden," Thomas assured her. "I was about to make dinner anyway." As Thomas prepared a simple meal of beans, bread, and coffee, Ayana sat by the fireplace and watched him work. There was something peaceful about the domestic scene, despite the dangerous circumstances that had brought them together. "Tell me about your ranch," Ayana said. "How long have you lived here?" 15 years, Thomas replied as he stirred the beans. "I came here after the war with nothing but a horse and a rifle, built everything you see from scratch." "It is good land," Ayana observed. "The grass is rich and there is water. Your cattle look healthy." Thomas was surprised by her knowledge of ranching. "You know about cattle." "My people have learned much from watching the white ranchers," Ayana said with a slight smile. "We are not all warriors and savages, despite what your newspapers say. Some of us understand farming and business." "I never believed those stories anyway," Thomas said. "I've had peaceful dealings with Apache before. Your people are smart and resourceful." They ate dinner in comfortable conversation, sharing stories about their different ways of life. Thomas was impressed by Ayana's intelligence and her ability to see both sides of the conflicts between their peoples. She spoke of wanting peace, but also of the need to protect Apache lands and traditions. As the evening wore on, Thomas began to worry about what would happen next. The kidnappers would certainly try to track them down, and they might bring reinforcements. His ranch was isolated, which had always been an advantage, but now it felt vulnerable. "Yana," he said finally, "I need to ask you something important. Are you the daughter of a chief or someone important in your tribe?" Yana hesitated before answering. "Why do you ask?" "Those men seem to think you were especially valuable." If you're someone important, it might explain why they took such a risk to kidnap you. My grandmother is a respected medicine woman, Yana said carefully. And my mother. My mother has some influence in tribal matters, but I am not a chief's daughter if that is what you mean. Thomas sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't press for details. Everyone had secrets, and Ayana had already been through enough. As midnight approached, Thomas showed Ayana to his spare room. It had been his wife's sewing room, but it had a comfortable bed and clean blankets. He gave her some of his late wife's clothes to replace her torn garments. Rest well, Thomas said. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to get you safely back to your people. Thank you, Thomas McKenna, Ayana said solemnly. I will never forget your kindness. As Thomas lay in his own bed that night, he couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made him reach for his rifle, wondering if the kidnappers had found them. But more than that, he found himself thinking about Ayana's remarkable beauty and quiet strength. There was something about her that stirred feelings he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. He told himself it was just sympathy for her situation, but deep down he knew it was more than that. Yana was unlike any woman he had ever met, white or Apache. She had a grace and dignity that couldn't be broken by hardship, and an intelligence that shone in her dark eyes. But Thomas also knew that nothing could come of such feelings. She was Apache, he was white, and they lived in different worlds that rarely came together peacefully. When dawn came, she would want to return to her people, and he would have to let her go. The last thing Thomas remembered before finally falling asleep was the sound of the wind outside his window, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of changes he couldn't yet imagine. Thomas woke before sunrise to the sound of horses approaching his ranch. His hand immediately went to the rifle beside his bed as he crept to the window to peer through the curtains. In the gray light of early dawn, he could see at least a dozen riders approaching across the open range. They moved with the fluid grace that marked them as Apache warriors, and they were armed for war. His heart sank as he realized what this meant. Iyana's people had come looking for her, and they probably assumed he was responsible for her disappearance. Thomas had dealt with Apache before, but never under circumstances like these. He knew that if they thought he had harmed Ayana, no amount of explanation would save him. Thomas quickly dressed and checked his weapons. He had several rifles and plenty of ammunition, but against a dozen Apache warriors, his chances weren't good. His only hope was that Ayana could convince them he had helped her, not hurt her. He knocked softly on the door to the spare room. Ayana, wake up, your people are here. The door opened immediately, revealing that Ayana had also heard the approaching horses. She was already dressed in the clean clothes Thomas had given her, and her dark hair was neatly braided. Despite the early hour, she looked alert and ready for whatever was to come. How many? She asked, moving to the window to look outside. About 12 warriors, Thomas replied. They look like they're ready for a fight. Ayana studied the approaching riders for a long moment. I know them, she said finally. The man in front is my brother Nalnish. The one beside him is my cousin Goyakla. They have come to find me. Will they listen to you? Thomas asked. Will they believe that I helped you? I will make them understand, Ayana said firmly. But you should know something, Thomas McKenna. I have not told you everything about who I am. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Before Ayana could answer, the sound of horses came to a halt outside the house. Thomas could hear the Apache warriors talking in their own language, their voices tense and urgent. He caught enough words to understand they were planning their approach. They're surrounding the house, Thomas said grimly. We need to go outside and face them before they decide to attack. Ayana nodded and walked toward the door. Stay behind me, she instructed. Let me speak first. Thomas followed Ayana onto the front porch, keeping his rifle lowered but ready. The Apache warriors had indeed surrounded the house, with arrows nocked and ready. Their leader, a tall man with fierce eyes and war paint on his face, sat his horse about 20 feet away. Yana stepped forward and spoke rapidly in Apache. Thomas couldn't understand most of what she said, but he could hear the relief in her brother's voice as he replied. The tension in the air lessened slightly, but the warriors remained alert and ready for trouble. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Ayana gesturing toward Thomas and explaining what had happened. Thomas could see some of the warriors relaxing as they listened, but others still looked suspicious and angry. Finally, Yana's brother dismounted and approached the porch. He was a powerful man, clearly a respected warrior, and his eyes burned with protective fury as he looked at Thomas. "This man," he said in heavily accented English, "you say he saved you from the kidnappers?" "Yes," Yana replied firmly. "He risked his life to save mine. Without his help, I would still be their prisoner or worse." The brothers studied Thomas for a long moment. "I am Nalnish, brother to Ayana. I thank you for helping my sister, but now she must come home with us." "Of course," Thomas said. "I understand she needs to return to her people. I'm just glad she's safe." Nalnish nodded approvingly, but then his expression grew serious. "There is something you must know, White Rancher, my sister. She is not just any Apache woman. She is the daughter of our chief's sister. More importantly, she is promised in marriage to the son of another chief, a union that will bring peace between our tribes." Thomas felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He looked at Yana, who couldn't meet his eyes. Suddenly, her reluctance to talk about her family made perfect sense. She wasn't just any Apache woman. She was essentially Apache royalty, and her marriage had been arranged to create a political alliance. "I didn't know," Thomas said quietly. "She didn't tell me." "It was not her place to share such information with a stranger," Nalnish said. "But you have earned our gratitude by saving her. Our chief will want to reward you for your bravery." As the Apache warriors began to prepare for departure, Thomas found himself struggling with unexpected emotions. He had known that Ayana would have to leave, but learning that she was promised to another man made it somehow worse. In just one night, she had awakened feelings in him that he thought had died with his wife. Yana finally approached him as her brother spoke with the other warriors. "Thomas," she said softly, "I am sorry I could not tell you about my engagement. It would have been inappropriate." "I understand," Thomas replied, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "You did what you had to do." "My people are grateful for what you did," Ayana continued. "My brother speaks truly. Our chief will want to honor you. Perhaps you could visit our village sometime as a friend." Thomas nodded, but he knew he could never do such a thing. Seeing Ayana married to another man would be too painful, and besides, he didn't really belong in her world any more than she belonged in his. Just as the Apache were about to leave, the sound of approaching horses came from the south. Thomas turned to see 3 riders approaching at a gallop, and his blood turned cold when he recognized them. It was the kidnappers from the night before, and they had brought reinforcements. "Trouble coming," Thomas called out to Nalnish, pointing toward the approaching riders. The Apache warriors immediately went into battle formation, taking cover behind rocks and trees. Thomas could see that these were experienced fighters who knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. Nalnish moved to protect Ayana while the others prepared for a fight. "Who are they?" Nalnish demanded. "The men who kidnapped your sister," Thomas explained quickly. "They must have tracked us here." The kidnappers rode up boldly, apparently not realizing how outnumbered they were. The scarred leader Thomas remembered from the canyon was in front, along with his 2 companions and 3 more rough-looking men. They all had guns drawn and looked ready for violence. "McKenna," the scarred man shouted, "we know you got our property. Send out the Apache girl and we might let you live." Thomas stepped forward, his rifle ready. "She's not your property, and she's not going anywhere with you." "Like hell she ain't," the leader snarled. "We caught her fair and square. She belongs to us now." That was when Nalnish stepped into view, and Thomas saw the kidnapper's face go pale. The Apache warrior was an intimidating sight in his war paint and traditional clothing, and his rifle was aimed directly at the leader's chest. "My sister belongs to no one but herself and her family," Nalnish said in his heavily accented but perfectly clear English. "You will leave now, or you will die." The other Apache warriors emerged from their hiding places, surrounding the kidnappers completely. The odds had suddenly shifted dramatically, and the would-be slavers found themselves facing a dozen expert fighters instead of one lone rancher. "Now hold on," the scarred leader said, his bravado quickly fading. "We didn't know she had family nearby. This is all just a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Ayana said, stepping forward with regal dignity, "is yours. You thought you could kidnap and sell Apache women without consequences. You were wrong." Thomas watched in admiration as Ayana confronted her former captors. Gone was any trace of the frightened victim he had rescued. In her place stood a proud Apache woman who clearly commanded respect even from her own warriors. It was obvious that she was used to being obeyed. "What do you want to do with them?" Thomas asked Nalnish. The Apache warrior considered for a moment. "Apache justice would be swift and final, but we are on your land and you saved my sister. What is your wish?" Thomas looked at the kidnappers, who were now clearly terrified. Part of him wanted to see them pay for what they had tried to do to Ayanna, but another part of him knew that killing them would only bring more trouble to both his ranch and the Apache. "I want them gone," Thomas said finally. "Far away from here, never to return. If they ever come back or if I hear of them bothering any more women, Apache or otherwise, they'll answer to me." "You hear?" Nalnish asked the kidnappers. "You leave now, you never return. If you do, we will know and we will find you." The scarred leader nodded frantically. "We're going right now, you won't see us again." The kidnappers wheeled their horses around and rode away as fast as they could go, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Thomas watched them disappear over the horizon, wondering if they would really stay away or if this was just the beginning of his troubles. With the immediate danger past, the Apache warriors began to relax. Several of them approached Thomas to express their gratitude for helping Ayanna. Despite the language barrier, their respect was clear, and Thomas found himself touched by their acceptance of him. As the sun climbed higher, Nalnish announced that it was time for them to leave. The Apache village was still 2 days' ride away, and they wanted to travel during the cooler parts of the day. Thomas watched as they prepared Ayanna's horse and made ready to depart. "Thomas," Ayanna said as she prepared to mount her horse, "I will never forget what you did for me. You risked everything to save a stranger, and that speaks to the goodness in your heart." "I just did what anyone would do," Thomas replied, though he knew that wasn't true. Many men would have ridden away rather than risk their lives for an Apache woman. "No," Ayanna said firmly. "Not everyone would have helped. You are a good man, Thomas McKenna." She reached into a small pouch at her belt and pulled out a beautiful turquoise pendant on a leather cord. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said, offering it to Thomas. "It is a token of our family's gratitude." Thomas started to protest, but Ayanna pressed the pendant into his hands. "Please," she said, "it will help you remember that not all meetings between our peoples end in bloodshed." As the Apache riders prepared to leave, Nalnish approached Thomas one more time. "Our chief will hear of what you did," he said. "You will always be welcome among our people. If you are ever in need, come to Red Mesa and ask for the village of Chief Cachillo. Any Apache will direct you." Thomas nodded his thanks, but he knew he would never make that journey. Ayanna would be married soon, and seeing her with another man would be too painful to bear. The Apache riders departed in a cloud of dust, with Ayanna looking back once before disappearing over a ridge. Thomas stood on his porch for a long time, watching the empty landscape and fingering the turquoise pendant she had given him. The rest of the day passed slowly. Thomas tried to return to his normal routine, checking on his cattle and working on ranch repairs, but his mind kept drifting to Ayanna. He found himself remembering her quiet strength, her intelligence, and the way she had looked at him when he rescued her from the canyon. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch watching the sunset, he heard horses approaching again. His heart leaped for a moment, thinking that perhaps Ayanna had returned. But when the rider came into view, Thomas saw it was Sheriff Morrison from the nearby town of Red Rock. "Evening, Thomas," the sheriff called as he rode up. "Mind if I water my horse and rest for a spell?" "Of course, Sheriff. What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Morrison was a good man who had known Thomas for years. He dismounted and led his horse to the water trough before answering. "Had some interesting visitors in town today," he said finally. "3 men claiming you and some Apache stole their property." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "Those would be the kidnappers I ran off this morning. They were holding an Apache woman against her will." "That's what I figured," the sheriff said with a grin. "Those boys didn't strike me as the honest type. Besides, I know you well enough to know you wouldn't steal anything." "They're gone now," Thomas said. "The woman's family came for her, and they made it clear the kidnappers weren't welcome in these parts." "Good," Sheriff Morrison said. "Those 3 were asking a lot of questions about you and your ranch. Wanted to know if you had any legal claim to this land, how many hands you employed, that sort of thing." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make me think they might be planning trouble," the sheriff replied seriously. "You might want to be extra careful for a while. Men like that don't like being shown up, especially by a lone rancher." After the sheriff left, Thomas found himself wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. By rescuing Iana, he had certainly done the right thing, but he might have also brought danger down on his head. The kidnappers clearly weren't the type to forget a grudge, and now they knew where he lived and how isolated his ranch was. As night fell, Thomas made sure all his weapons were loaded and ready. He checked the doors and windows and even considered riding to a neighbor's ranch for the night. But in the end, he decided to stay. This was his land, his home, and he wouldn't be driven away by threats. The night passed peacefully, but Thomas slept fitfully, starting awake at every sound. When morning finally came, he was exhausted but determined to continue his normal routine. He had cattle to tend and fences to repair, and he wouldn't let fear control his life. It was around noon when Thomas saw the dust cloud approaching from the north. At first he thought it might be more trouble, but as the riders came closer, he recognized Apache horses and clothing. A small party of warriors was approaching his ranch, and leading them was an elderly woman riding a beautiful painted mare. Thomas walked out to meet them, wondering what this new development could mean. The elderly woman was clearly someone important, judging by the deference the warriors showed her. She was dressed in elaborate traditional clothing with intricate beadwork, and her gray hair was adorned with feathers and silver ornaments. When the party stopped in front of his house, the elderly woman dismounted with the fluid grace of someone much younger. She approached Thomas with regal bearing, her dark eyes studying him intently. "You are Thomas McKenna," she said in perfect English, surprising him with her lack of accent. "I am Paloma, mother of Ayana. I have come to speak with you." Thomas stared at the elderly Apache woman in shock. This was Ayana's mother, but she looked nothing like what he had expected. Where Ayana had inherited her father's Apache features softened by Mexican blood, Paloma was clearly a woman of mixed heritage herself. Her skin was weathered by years in the desert sun, but her bone structure and the shape of her eyes suggested European ancestry. "Please," Thomas said, recovering his manners, "won't you come inside? You and your men must be tired from your journey." Paloma studied him for a long moment before nodding. "That is kind of you. Yes, we will rest briefly." She turned and spoke to her warriors in Apache, and they immediately set about tending to their horses and making a small camp near Thomas's water trough. As they walked toward the house, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this visit was about more than simple gratitude. There was something in Paloma's manner, a sense of purpose that suggested she had come here for a specific reason. Inside the house, Paloma examined Thomas's belongings with keen interest. Her eyes lingered on the Apache rugs and pottery that his late wife had collected, and she nodded approvingly at the care with which they were displayed. "You appreciate our craftsmanship," she observed, running her fingers along one of the woven blankets. "My wife did," Thomas replied. "She always said that Apache artisans were the finest in the territory." "Your wife was wise," Paloma said. "What was her name?" Sarah McKenna." Thomas found it strange to be speaking of his dead wife with an Apache woman he had just met, but there was something about Paloma that invited confidence. "And she died of fever, my daughter tells me." Paloma's voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. "How long were you married?" 10 years, Thomas replied. "We never had children, it was just the two of us." Paloma nodded thoughtfully. "Loneliness is a heavy burden for a man. This ranch, it is all you have now." Thomas was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the personal nature of her questions, but he answered politely. "I have my cattle, my land. It's enough." "Is it?" Paloma asked, fixing him with a penetrating stare. "My daughter spoke of you with great admiration. She said you risked your life for a stranger, asked nothing in return. This speaks of a good heart, but also of a lonely one." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I did what any decent person would do. There's nothing more to it than that." Paloma smiled slightly, and Thomas suddenly saw where Yana had inherited her ability to see through people. "My daughter also told me something else," she continued. "She said that when you looked at her, you saw not an Apache woman to be feared or pitied, but simply a person in need of help. This is rare among your people." "Not as rare as you might think," Thomas protested. "There are many who want peace between our peoples." "Perhaps," Paloma said, "but you proved it with actions, not just words." She moved to the window and gazed out at Thomas's ranch. "This is good land, water, grass, shelter from the wind. A man could build a life here." "I have built a life here," Thomas said. 15 years of work." Yes, Paloma agreed. But tell me, Thomas McKenna, what happens to this land when you die? Who will inherit what you have built? The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. It was something he tried not to think about, the fact that he had no heirs, no one to carry on what he had created. When he died, the ranch would probably be sold to pay his debts, and everything he had worked for would disappear. I haven't given it much thought, Thomas lied. Paloma turned from the window and fixed him with her knowing stare. I think you have given it much thought. A man does not work so hard for something he believes will die with him. Before Thomas could respond, Paloma continued. In our culture, land belongs to the people, not to individuals. But we understand that your people see things differently. We also understand that sometimes different ways of thinking can work together. What are you trying to say? Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. My daughter's engagement, Paloma said bluntly. It was arranged when she was a child. The young man she was to marry, he is brave but foolish. Last month he was killed in a raid against Mexican soldiers. The engagement is ended. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat, but he tried to keep his expression neutral. I'm sorry for your loss. It was not our loss, Paloma said with a slight smile. The boy was hot-headed and reckless. His death, while tragic, may have saved us from a difficult alliance. His father is quick to anger and slow to forgive. Peace with his tribe would have been hard to maintain. So Ayana is free, Thomas asked carefully. She is free to choose her own path, Paloma confirmed. And she has spoken to me of the white rancher who saved her life. She speaks of his kindness, his courage, his honor. She also speaks of something else, something she perhaps does not fully understand yet. Thomas felt his mouth go dry. What do you mean? Paloma moved closer, her dark eyes boring into his. She speaks of you as a woman speaks of a man she cares for. And you, Thomas McKenna, when you speak of my daughter, your voice changes, your eyes soften. You care for her too. That's impossible, Thomas protested, though his voice lacked conviction. We hardly know each other. She's Apache, I'm white. Our worlds are too different. Are they? Paloma challenged. You both value honor, courage, and kindness. You both understand the land and respect its power. You both have known loss and learned to be strong. How are your worlds so different? Thomas struggled to find an answer. Everything Paloma said was true, but it didn't change the practical realities. Even if what you say is true, it doesn't matter. Society would never accept such a union. She would be shunned by white people, and I would be seen as a traitor by mine. Society, Paloma said with a dismissive wave of her hand. What does society know of the heart? What does it know of love that crosses the boundaries men create? Love, Thomas repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, love, Paloma said firmly. Do not pretend you do not feel it. I have lived long enough to recognize the signs. My daughter feels it too, though she fights against it because she believes, as you do, that such love is impossible. Thomas sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what Paloma was saying. He had tried to deny his feelings for Ayana, to convince himself that it was just sympathy or admiration. But hearing Paloma put it so bluntly forced him to confront the truth. Even if you're right, he said finally, what can be done? The obstacles are too great. Paloma smiled, and for the first time, Thomas saw warmth rather than calculation in her expression. The obstacles are not as great as you think, but they require a different solution than what either of our peoples might expect. What kind of solution? Instead of answering directly, Paloma asked another question. Tell me about your ranch. How much land do you own? Thomas was confused by the change of subject, but he answered honestly. 2,000 acres. It's all legally mine, bought and paid for. And your cattle, how many head? About 500, plus horses and other livestock. Paloma nodded approvingly. This is a substantial holding. In our culture, such wealth would make you a chief. In yours, I believe the term is cattle baron. I wouldn't go that far, Thomas protested. I'm just a rancher trying to make a living. You are modest, Paloma observed. But modesty will not solve our problem. Tell me, if someone were to challenge your claim to this land, how would you prove ownership? I have the deeds, Thomas said, still puzzled by her line of questioning. Legal documents filed with the territorial government. And if those documents were lost or destroyed? I have copies in the bank in town. Why are you asking about this? Paloma's expression grew serious. Because, Thomas McKenna, there are men who would like to see you lose this land. The kidnappers you drove away, they were not just slave traders. They work for a man named Garrett Stone, a businessman from back east who has been buying up ranches in this territory. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard of Garrett Stone, a ruthless businessman who used intimidation and legal trickery to force small ranchers to sell their land for far less than it was worth. "How do you know this?" Thomas asked. "We watch and listen," Paloma said simply. "Stone's men have been asking questions about you in town. They know about your wife's death, your isolation, the fact that you have no family to help you if trouble comes. They think you are vulnerable." "But I have legal ownership," Thomas protested. "They can't just take my land." Paloma's smile was grim. "Legal ownership means nothing if you are dead or if you can be forced to sell through threats and violence. Stone has done this to a dozen ranchers already. He uses men like those kidnappers to make life unbearable until his victims give up and sell." Thomas began to understand the scope of the threat he faced. "So what do you suggest I do? Sell and run?" "No," Paloma said firmly. "I suggest you make yourself unattackable. I suggest you gain the protection of the Apache Nation." "How could I possibly do that?" "By marrying my daughter," Paloma said bluntly. "By becoming family." Thomas stared at her in shock. "You're suggesting I marry Ayanna to gain political protection." "I am suggesting you marry my daughter because you love her and she loves you," Paloma corrected. "The political protection would simply be a benefit of such a union." "But the problems I mentioned before would be solved by the marriage itself," Paloma interrupted. "Once you are family, you would be under the protection of our tribe. Stone's men might threaten a lone white rancher, but they would think twice about attacking the husband of a chief's niece." Thomas's mind reeled as he tried to process what Paloma was proposing. "And Ayanna, what does she think of this plan?" "I have not discussed it with her yet," Paloma admitted. "But I have watched her since she returned home. She is not happy. She speaks little, eats less, and spends her time staring toward the south, toward your ranch. A mother knows when her daughter's heart is elsewhere." "This is all happening too fast," Thomas said, running his hands through his hair. "Yesterday I was a simple rancher. Now you're talking about marriage and tribal alliances and business conspiracies." "Life moves fast on the frontier," Paloma said pragmatically. "Those who hesitate often find themselves left behind or worse. Stone's men could strike at any time. Without protection, you could lose everything you have worked for." "And with your protection?" "With our protection, your ranch would be safe. Your cattle would multiply under our watchful eyes. Your land would remain yours, and when you die, it would pass to your children, my grandchildren." The mention of children made Thomas's heart ache. It had been his greatest regret that he and Sarah had never been blessed with a family. The thought of having children with Ayanna, of building something lasting together, was almost too wonderful to contemplate. "But the practical problems," Thomas said, still struggling with doubt. "How would it work? Would Ayanna live here? Would I be expected to live with your tribe?" "You would live as husband and wife wherever you choose," Paloma said. "Some of our people have married whites before. It requires adjustments from both sides, but it can work if there is love and respect." "And your people, would they accept a white husband for Ayanna?" "My brother is the chief," Paloma said with a smile. "And I am his most trusted advisor. If I say the marriage is good for our people, he will support it. As for the others, they will follow his lead, especially once they understand the benefits." "What benefits?" "A permanent alliance with a successful white rancher," Paloma explained. "Access to markets for our goods, a safe place for our people to trade and rest when traveling, protection for our children who wish to learn white ways without abandoning their heritage." Thomas began to see the larger picture Paloma was painting. This wasn't just about his feelings for Ayanna or even about protecting his ranch. It was about building bridges between two peoples who had been enemies for too long. "And Stone, how would marriage to Ayanna protect me from him?" "Stone makes his living by intimidating isolated ranchers," Paloma said. "But you would no longer be isolated. You would have dozens of Apache warriors who consider you family. Stone's men might face down one rancher, but they would not willingly fight the entire Apache nation." The plan was audacious, but Thomas could see the logic in it. More than that, he could feel the truth of what Paloma had said about his feelings for Ayanna. He did love her, had loved her since the moment he saw her in that canyon. The question was whether he had the courage to act on that love. I need to think about this, Thomas said finally. You need to decide quickly, Paloma corrected. Stone's men are already moving. My scouts have seen them gathering in town. They plan to strike soon before you have time to prepare or call for help. How soon? Tonight, perhaps tomorrow. They know you are alone and that help is far away. They think this makes you easy prey. Thomas felt a surge of anger at the thought of Stone's men attacking his ranch, trying to steal everything he had worked for. The idea of having the strength to fight back, of having allies who would stand with him, was appealing. If I agreed to this, Thomas said carefully, how would it happen? I can't exactly ride into your village and ask for Ayana's hand. Paloma's eyes twinkled with amusement. In our culture, courtship and marriage can happen very quickly when circumstances require it. If Ayana agrees, we could perform the ceremony today before Stone's men can act. Today, Thomas felt his heart racing, but that's practical, Paloma finished. Love is a luxury, Thomas McKenna. On the frontier, survival comes first. You can court my daughter properly after you are both safe. Before Thomas could respond, one of Paloma's warriors appeared at the door and spoke rapidly in Apache. Paloma's expression grew grim as she listened to his report. What is it? Thomas asked. My scout has returned from town, Paloma said. Stone's men are already on their way. 20 armed men led by those same kidnappers you humiliated. They will be here before sunset. Thomas felt his blood turn cold. 20 men was more than he could handle alone, even with his rifles and knowledge of the terrain. What do you suggest? I suggest you decide quickly whether you want to face them as a lone rancher or as the protected husband of my daughter, Paloma said bluntly. Because they will be here soon, and once they arrive, the choice may be taken from us. Thomas looked out the window at his ranch, at the land he had spent 15 years building into something beautiful and productive. The thought of losing it all to greedy men who had never worked a day in the sun filled him with rage. But more than that, the thought of being able to share his life with Ayana, of building something together that would last beyond their lifetimes, filled him with hope. All right, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was agreeing to. If Ayana will have me, I'll marry her, today. Paloma smiled broadly, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked genuinely pleased. I thought you might see reason. Now we must move quickly. My daughter is waiting with the rest of our party about a mile north of here. I will send for her while you prepare yourself. Prepare myself how? Clean clothes would be appropriate, Paloma said with a motherly tone. And perhaps you should shave. A woman appreciates a man who makes an effort for their wedding day, even under these circumstances. As Paloma went outside to send for Yana, Thomas found himself moving in a daze. Was he really about to marry an Apache woman he had known for less than 2 days? Was he really about to stake his future on love and political alliance with a people most of his neighbors considered enemies? The answer, he realized, was yes, because the alternative was to lose everything anyway and to spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. At least this way, he would be fighting for something worth having, with someone he cared about by his side. Thomas cleaned himself up as best he could and put on his best clothes. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he wondered what Sarah would think of what he was about to do. He hoped she would understand that a man had to take chances sometimes, had to reach for happiness when it was offered, even if the circumstances weren't ideal. When Paloma returned, she was accompanied by Ayana and several more Apache women. Yana was dressed in the most beautiful traditional clothing Thomas had ever seen, with intricate beadwork and silver ornaments that caught the afternoon light. Her dark hair was adorned with flowers and feathers, and her pale skin seemed to glow with an inner radiance. But it was her eyes that captured Thomas's attention. They were bright with a mixture of hope, fear, and love that took his breath away. When their eyes met, he knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Hello, Thomas, Ayana said softly. My mother tells me you have something to ask me.